different from indigenous women, rural women, young women that are minors. But for women living with HIV, it translates to the health providers making the decision for them. So we have cases of women with HIV that want to have their children, and the health providers force them to have abortion. Because in Latin America, HIV services are separated from HIV, from sexual and reproductive health services. And that translates in the sexual and reproductive health providers having a lack of understanding and updating information about evidence on prevention, including perinatal contraception. It also includes that when a woman wants to have children and she expresses that desire, instead of taking the opportunity to give the information that she needs and deserves to have a safe conception, they will call them even as psychiatric case because they don't understand that just because they have a diagnosis, they should stop their reproductive and sexual lives. And this goes to the extreme of women having children and being sterilized at the time of delivery without information, without letting them know, or even taking the opportunity with another surgery to do the sterilization. Sometimes they use the general consent form for the surgery, and those consent forms are sometimes signed by the mothers of those women, and then the mothers will feel guilty because they were the ones signing the consent that as a result has a forced sterilization. Now, this is also accompanied by a culture of protection amongst health providers. So they will hire all the proofs and protect themselves to make it happen as if it was consent. And it will also be sometimes the human rights commissions who will, if the women take the case to those spaces, they will hide the documentation and steal it. So access to justice is the second challenge on reproductive justice for women, especially for women with HIV in my country. It's Mexico and Central America, so it's Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua.
Thanks, Eugenia. Okay. Dázon, I'm coming at you now. Okay. Our next guest, Dázon Dixon Diallo, a long-time, fearless leader and advocate. You have changed the landscape of HIV organizing, and you've shifted what is possible in terms of advocacy and thinking about the universe of, in particular, women, but not only women, in relation to this pandemic for decades. Thank you. Dázon is a longtime human rights, reproductive justice, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and HIV advocate, and founder and president of a great organization called Sister Love that was in 1989. That was the first women's HIV and sexual and reproductive justice organization in the Southeast U.S. You've done deep organizing in South Africa in particular, but your work has crossed region. You've been a trailblazer since then. Your bias is 37 years in health justice, women's liberation, and human rights. I'm going to say that when you were a baby, you were probably doing this work. Key question. Yeah. Can you name a key reproductive justice issue in your context and how it's connected to HIV?
I sure can. love you, Cynthia. And I will take a little privilege outside my 3 minutes and not assume that everybody has an idea of reproductive justice, because despite the fact that reproductive justice is about 26 years going now, most people, a lot of people still don't really understand it. And I'm a godmother of reproductive justice in the movement, co-founder of Sister Song. So, very simple. You take the idea of reproductive rights, which for so long was very limited, very myopic, very much only representative, quite frankly, in the earlier days of white women's interests. Let's be real, especially in the U.S. context, but expanding and exporting that globally. So it's this Western notion that our lives are centered around abortion and contraception. But then when you pull in the context of being black and brown or poor or having a disability or having a different identity from the majority, right? Then we're talking social justice. So when you combine the notion of all of the intersectionality of social justice and you make reproductive health and rights more intersectional, you get reproductive justice. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's about the if and when and how I choose to have children, to not have children, and to parent the children that I do have in safe, economically viable, and secure, prospering communities. And the fourth one is that I also have the right to my bodily autonomy to decide what happens in my own destiny. That's the context which makes reproductive justice more about building the movement than providing health care or fighting for the rights. Just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page on that. Are we together? So in the context of what we do at Sister Love, which is very intentionally at the intersections of HIV and sexual and reproductive health, access to care, rights, protection under the law, and justice is the equity in the human rights context. I got a couple of key issues that combine into one. The main one is about inclusion and equity. Now, you cannot leave any woman behind, regardless of how she identifies as a woman. You can't leave her out. You can't forget. You can't minimize the impact and the effect of what their own lives of living with HIV or being affected by HIV means for the whole universe. Inside of that comes bodily autonomy and personal safety. So just like Eugenia was just saying, the issues, especially for black women living with HIV, because there is a racial justice lens to this that matters. There's the violence of forced sterilization. There's the violence that happens in its context around gender-based violence, sexual violence, intimate violence. But there's also the issue of forced and coerced abortion as violence. There's the issue of forced motherhood as violence. And so if we brought the biggest issue to it, it is the violations of women's human rights that actually show up as violence in all of the contexts, including economic and political. And to close on that, it all doesn't matter if we are not living in a world where we recognize the independent and individual agency that people make decisions for themselves, their children, their churches, their synagogues, their mosques, their schools, their communities, every single day should have all the power to make every decision they need to make for themselves. Full stop.
Thank you, Dázon. And Sia, I'm going to come to you next, and then just to give you foreshadowing, Akela, Mariana, and then we'll close with Steve, okay? All right. So, in Sia Mankani, who I just met a few minutes ago, and I adore you already.
Exactly.
You are at a great organization called Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights. Your work is in public affairs. You do some work with parliamentarians, which cannot be very simple. So thank you for doing that work. You're formerly with Human Rights Watch, where you were Senior Advocacy and Development Coordinator. You're based in Canada. I don't know why I'm telling you who you are. That's who she is. Lovely to have you with us. Let me give this to you.
Thank you so much. I'm honestly a little bit intimidated, apologies, because I'll probably be saying exactly the same things, probably the same words, because I've used all of your resources to make all of my notes. I've only been with Action Canada for 4 months, so I am incredibly honored to be on this panel with all of these incredible women. I have not been doing this work for 37 years, but I'm trying to do it as passionately and learn as I go. I think in terms of key issues, I think it's so hard to identify key issues because they're all so interlinked, and through reproductive justice, we know that they're all dependent on community conditions. So Action Canada focuses on 4 main areas, which are abortion, contraception, access to comprehensive sex ed, and SRHR advocacy, which is sexual and reproductive health and rights advocacy. But if you're talking about abortion, for example, we know that in Canada, abortion is enshrined within the Canada Health Act as healthcare, so we don't have a specific law like Roe v. Wade, which could immediately be overturned and limit access to abortion. So it's not really about choice in Canada, but it is about access, and choice without access isn't really a choice at all. So I think while we didn't feel the immediate impact of Roe v. Wade, we did feel the aftershocks of it. And we know that lack of access to abortion is a way to keep people in poverty. And we know that poverty also increases the risks of engaging in risky sexual behavior, which increases the risk of HIV, which impacts your ability to negotiate condoms, which impacts your ability to access comprehensive sex care, which impacts your ability to raise your children in a safe environment and make choices for yourself when you are economically desperate. You aren't in charge of the choices you make, so I think that is a big one. And I think one of the big things, if we're talking about abortion, then we also have to talk about the flip side of it, which is the forced sterilization of HIV-positive people, and like Dázon mentioned, forced motherhood and forced abortions and forced sterilizations. It really, at the end of the day, these communities know what they need, and it is the communities that are most marginalized that are severely impacted by this. The communities know what they need, but if you don't give them access to the resources, even if the country does have them, you're not really giving them much of a choice at all. So I think that's the big thing. So I think for me, a lot of it is that SRHR issues are often seen as siloed, and they're often deprioritized either one thing or the other, but it affects it as a large. And we've seen that during the pandemic when STD-BI treatments were deprioritized. A lot of the treatment centers were re-engaged as COVID testing centers. So we saw an immediate rise in STDs, including HIV, and we saw that in the most important communities, including in indigenous communities. So I think that's one of the big things, is not allowing communities to be in charge of their own care.
Thank you. I'm changing the order. I'm making an executive decision. I'm changing the order. Mariana, are you willing to answer that question? Okay, excellent. Mariana is a feminist, a social worker living with HIV. She's a national coordinator of a network of women living with HIV in Argentina, and involved in the regional coordination of ICW Latin America. And you're a mom, you're a mother of someone who I understand is very, very special. So that's very lovely.
India.
Thank you.
Oh, no, sorry.
Bueno, gracias por la traducción y gracias que puedan considerar que esté alguien que no hable inglés y necesite traducción primero.
Thank
you for the translation and for considering that someone who could be in this panel might not be able to communicate so well in English.
El tema que voy a abordar es lactancia, tanto lactancia forzada como la prohibición de amamantar, la carga que se le pone a las mujeres y personas gestantes en la lactancia, cómo la tienen que hacer, o cuando deciden no amamantar por decisión, igual se presionan desde los sistemas de salud. Esto se repite tanto en América Latina como en Argentina. Voy a hablar de América Latina en general por el trabajo de ICW en América Latina.
So the issue that she's going to focus today is lactancy, both forced or prohibited, and the weight on the lactating women and the pressure that comes from society when it comes to this topic, and the lack of capacity of making her own decision about this issue. And the context she's going to speak about is Latin America, and Mariana is specifically based in Argentina.
Y el vínculo, en cuanto a la segunda pregunta, el vínculo con el VIH y lactancia materna, tiene que ver con la prohibición de amamantar. En todos los países de América Latina se siguen las recomendaciones de OMS, que no son claras y que no permiten amamantar a las mujeres con VIH, por lo tanto hay una opción que es la de leche de fórmula.
So the connection with HIV is the prohibition of maternal lactancy that we see in Latin America. This is due to the lack of clarity in the WHO guidelines for women living with HIV who breastfeed, and the strong emphasis on formal.
En América Latina nuestros estados piensan que hay agua potable en toda la región y eso no ocurre, por lo tanto tampoco estaría correcto dar una sola opción, que en este caso sería la leche de fórmula.
In Latin America, the states, they don't have like a comprehensive understanding, and they are just following like a unique approach that is just giving the formula.
Sorry. The guidelines of the WHO are not very clear, and they assume that in Latin America there is potable water always, and that's why it is only formula, the only option that women with HIV have.
Es muy importante poder tener todas las opciones. Ayer estuvimos en un panel súper poderoso sobre lactancia materna y entender que necesitamos todas las opciones para poder decidir sobre nuestros cuerpos, y que el no amamantar también carga mucho estigma y discriminación en las mujeres con VIH, y por esto queremos tener todas las opciones, además de todo lo bueno que trae la lactancia materna para mujeres con VIH y personas gestantes.
Y lo importante es que hagan. Sorry, I'm in my last sprint here of this conference. I'm tired. So the important thing is that there are options for women. Yesterday I was in a very important panel about breastfeeding, where we discussed the need to have the power to decide about our own bodies.
También es súper importante que tengamos en cuenta que la lactancia es un tema más de batalla de parte de todas las personas y los sistemas que quieren controlar el cuerpo de nosotras las mujeres, y que tenemos que tomar ese frente de lucha para poder lograr tener lactancia materna cuando lo decidamos y tengamos las condiciones. Gracias.
The lactancy is one more issue that is used to control our bodies, and that we have to keep fighting for our right to decide whether or not we want to breastfeed, and to have the necessary support and resources to do so as we decide.
Sorry, just one element that is very relevant for reproductive justice that Mariana was mentioned is that breastfeeding has benefits for the health of the baby as well as the woman or the person that is gestating long-term health benefits that are neglected because of the lack of clarity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And actually, I'm going to ask you just to simply introduce yourself. I don't want you to be invisible in your great contribution.
My name is Alini. I work as the program officer for the Love Alliance program at the Global Network of People Living with HIV.
Thank you so very much. Kayla, we got you now. Okay. Kayla Galloway is a lawyer. And tell me if I'm saying this right. You're with a program or a fellowship called If, When, and How. And that's in HIV and reproductive justice and sister love. You're an alum. Let me do this. She, third person, is an alum of the University of North Carolina in a city called Charlotte, Southern University Law School. Okay. And I just met you and I adore you also already. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I would just like to take a moment to amplify the fact that chest feeding is a very real issue, and I was thinking about it in the context, and I think it was a great foundation for me to start. When we think about chest feeding, when we think about reproductive justice, oftentimes, especially in the States, we think about abortion access. We don't necessarily get to that tenet about our family planning and how we decide to function in our families. And chest feeding is a very important part of parenting, and a very important part of just the parenting process. In my lived context, I will say that I am a Black woman living in the South. I'm a former sex worker, and I work at Sister Love. And the work that I do surrounds a lot around HIV policy. One of the main things that I'm focused on is HIV criminalization, which is basically the criminalization of behaviors that would otherwise be illegal if not for a person's HIV status. So when we think about HIV and pleasure, we think about people who have sex, who act out their sexual desires, should not be criminalized for those types of behaviors. So we talk about reproductive justice, and as a Black woman, and as a sex worker, we think about all the ways in which, and as a queer person, all the intersections in which I personally live, and I'm put at a threat of being criminalized. So in my work, what I'm basically doing is fighting for those who are living with HIV, whose lives are, again, placed at an increased level of surveillance, policing, and threat of criminalization. Again, because I am a Black woman, we do see that Black women are dying at exponential rates in police custody. Black women are some of the fastest growing population in the U.S. prison system. So when we're put at threat of dying, we're not being provided with equitable access to resources. We kind of see those RJ tenets and where we show up and we show out as advocates. And I'll get there in short.
I probably don't have to stand in order to hand the mic to our next guest, Steve. So, Steve Letzifi has been a buddy for a long time. And Steve, it's lovely as always to sit next to you and to be near you. The one thing I will say that some folks know and others don't is that Steve gives great hugs. Steve is just a fantastic hugger. No one's smiling. That's a great quality. Okay, good. Okay, very good. Steve is the founder and executive director of an organization based in South Africa called Access Chapter 2. Steve's an activist, a feminist, a human rights advocate. Steve's also the co-chair of the South African National AIDS Council and the co-chair of the South African National Task Team that addresses hate crimes and gender-based violence. Please feel free to add anything else. Steve, a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was warm welcome. I can hear my voice is gone after the long week of conferencing. Good afternoon, everyone. I still have the activist voice, right? It's a mantra. Viva women, viva! Viva! And we have to speak about women in all their diversities. And I think it's quite important for us to talk and think a little bit more around, gender diverse women, trans women, lesbian women, women with disability, and so forth and so forth. And I think it's quite important to think about what is the agency. Because first, across the spectrum, even of women in their diversity, we speak about bodily autonomy. And I think when we speak about reproductive right, it's that bodily autonomy. But it's also second point, which we need to reflect around self-determination and timing. And it's quite important. We are fighting many struggles as women. The fact that even when you speak about women who are gender non-conforming or lesbian, even just the issue that one, you have to even fight for retaining your reproductive agency. I mean, we are questioned, we are interrogated, and we are attacked. And if, as a black lesbian woman who's not cis, for that matter, you are questioned if you're going to be having babies. If you're talking about trans person, the fact that you want to even retain, so you're not even talking only about abortion, or you're not even talking about, you're even talking about retaining fertility or your own reproductive system. So there are quite a lot of issues that we have to think about. The structural discrimination and structural violence, systematic violence that many of us are subjected to. First, some of our countries still criminalize us. And I think it's quite important that we recognize that we see this. Secondly, you do not exist. So even in a country where you are not criminalized, you are not recognized, then no services. And I think it's important. For a number of times we speak about walking into a health facility and you are checking whether this health facility, one, has competent NFL services for you. No. So we're talking about what does it mean for HIV? What does it mean even just for your local existence and access to services? And I mean, we can even go further and further, really about what happens. Our bodies are sites of struggle. And I'm happy that you raised even issues even about forced sterilization. These are daily realities of many of women who are diverse and they're experiencing forced sterilization, unnecessary surgeries. You talk about intersex persons for that matter, unnecessary genital mutilation for that matter. And I think it's really important because if we're going to be unpacking reproductive justice, we must dismantle these inequalities, this systematic violence and discrimination that we live through. Now, what do we need to be doing with all of that? Because we know these are bodies that we're talking about. First, we own our bodies. We own our bodies. So which means I can decide when, how, and whether I want to have children or not, or I want to have sex or not, or I want to even have sex using having PrEP as an option, or having a ring as an option, and so forth. And I think it's quite important for all of us to have options, but also for all of us to have access. And these inequalities, because what is happening in the States, what is happening in Latin America, what is happening in Africa, are completely different realities. And I think we also need to think about how do we extend an arm of solidarity amongst each other, because those privileges, we all want everybody to experience. Thank you so much.
So that's actually a perfect segue to the second question that I'm going to pose to you. Let me introduce this question. It is a question about collective action and solidarity. But you said something, Steve, very important, and that's that the contexts are different. There are some similarities, there are some things that cut across culture, but context is everything. I am, and some of you are, based in the United States, where we are living in, you know the expression, a shit show? It's a shit show. Every day, and it's not worth going into the, into the details. In Latin America, there have been extraordinary victories around issues of abortion. The activism, feminist activism, has been unbelievable. Other kinds of activism are unbelievable. So the context part is that makes all the difference. So then the question becomes, what actions, what collective actions do you all recommend or need, both in terms of solidarity but in terms of making the demands? There's a whole mosaic of options available to us, to you. So what are the things that are most urgent in terms of collective action? And I'll add the term solidarity because that fits. Can we start with you and simply come down the line? Is that all right? Okay.
Bueno, como dijo la compañera, América Latina en términos de acción colectiva está bien potente, tanto con la marea verde por el aborto legal, seguro y gratuito.
Como disse, how our colleague said, in Latin America, in terms of collective action, we are making very good progress in terms of the green wave and in terms of obtaining access to legal, safe, and safe abortion.
And free. And free abortion.
And free.
También en Argentina acabamos de tener una nueva ley de VIH, la anterior tenía más de 30 años y en esa pudimos incluir un artículo específico sobre la entrega de leche de fórmula que logramos que se ampliara desde los 6 meses hasta el año y medio, porque ningún bebé deja de tomar leche de fórmula inmediatamente, pero sin embargo el Estado solo la entregaba cronológicamente hasta los 6 meses.
And also in Argentina, there recently a new HIV law has been passed. The previous one was more than 30 years old, and there is a specific article about the provision of formula milk to babies, whereby the recommendation from the government was to expand the delivery of formula from 6 months to 1 year old and a half. Because many babies, they can't stop immediately having milk when they're 6 months.
Y lo que necesitamos, no sé si era la pregunta que viene después, pero lo que necesitamos en términos de acción colectiva con la lactancia materna de mujeres con VIH es debatir primero a la interna del movimiento y después sacar una estrategia para exigir que las guías de OMS sean claras y que nuestros estados puedan dar múltiples ofertas a las mujeres con VIH en términos de lactancia.
So she doesn't know whether she's already addressing the next question, but she's going to say what we need in terms of collective action is to organize internally within the movement and then develop a strategy to make sure that the WHO guidelines are cleared and enforced according to the needs of women.
Thank you.
We are in the second question. Okay, so I think that we need to stop fragmenting ourselves. We need to unify and consolidate our struggles, our demands. and understand that all of this is coming from the inequity, injustice, and inequalities that are through our lives, but also in the social conditions that we live. We cannot keep providing different agendas and fragmenting all the movement. We have to come together.
I was very similar. I love how Sister Song defines reproductive justice. Oh, sorry. Okay. I love how Sister Song defines reproductive justice, and thank you so much for explaining it so concisely. I think with SRHR, it's in so many international treaties, but that alone can't fix the issues that we have with reproductive justice. What is required is political will, and we know that the rollback that we're seeing of reproductive rights across the globe is an early warning sign, or the canary in the coal mine, if you will, on a global backlash on human rights and democracy. And I think the way we increase the political will for reproductive justice movements and issues is by breaking down the silos that exist across our movements and sectors and coming together and demanding action. But finally, I think I'd also be remiss not to mention the voices that were represented in this room. I think being from Canada and this conference being held here, one of the big things that I've heard in this conference mentioned again and again and again is for reproductive justice issues to be solved and for there to be uptake. It needs to be community sensitive and community led and community driven. And for so many activists from marginalized communities who are affected by this to not be because their visas have been denied, because they haven't been invited. It's a damn shame. So I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we need to create spaces at the tables for those voices.
Yes, as the young folks say, retweet to all of and yeah, so I would first like to say that repression breeds resistance, and so we're going to continue to resist at all stages. We're going to continue to do that, but I think that at the end we need to trust Black women, we need to trust the youth, trust the youth, and make sure that we are investing in those voices, investing in how they choose to show up. I know as for me, one of my biggest things is making sure that voices are heard and making sure I'm taking the time to listen. Because sometimes my struggle is different from what my sister is struggling with. So how do we build these connections between our communities to make sure that our movement goes further? It's not my personal ministry to dismantle white supremacy, but it does need to be dismantled. I'm not there to educate, but I'm there to help you burn it down. And I definitely think we need to lock arms and do more things like this. And yes, that's my piece.
Shall I sing? So here's the thing. Thank you, Akela. You literally took the words right out of my mouth. But what I think is most important, as we're really talking about solidarity, is I want to go with two frames. So the first frame, and some of you know this, but I quote this person all the time. I used to call him my movement husband, but I'm like, he doesn't know me. One. Two, I don't know him, so I don't know what he's into. But I might not be appropriate. So now I call him my movement muse. And that's the incomparable Brian Stevenson, who is a human rights attorney. He focuses on two of the hardest issues you can think of in the U.S. He fights for people who are on death row, and he fights to keep juveniles off death row and from getting life sentences as teenagers. That's a hard job. And he holds on to what I call his 4 tenets for sustaining social justice and social change. The first one is you have to be proximate. You have to engage proximity. The people, as Ayanna Pressley, the congresswoman from Boston, Massachusetts, says it best, the people who are closest to the pain must be the people closest to the power. And so that means the proliferary mode. You have to create the spaces, set as many tables as possible. You don't need one table. You go to a banquet, there's 50 tables all serving the same thing on the same cutlery with the same cute little centerpiece. Everybody can have the same thing and be different at the table. Second is you gotta change with something different. We substantiate the new language with new ideas, practices, commitments. So for example, reproductive justice didn't just change what is reproductive rights, it changed the entire trajectory and the environment of how we fight for our own human rights based on whatever our humanity requires. The third one is you gotta be able to protect the hope. You gotta learn from the stories of resilience, of success, or the lessons learned from our failures, so that we know that we are winning. If we were winning, they wouldn't be fighting so hard to silence us. If we weren't winning, they wouldn't be already striking down rights we had for 60 years. If we weren't winning, they wouldn't be scrambling so hard to make sure that your voices are not heard in the political space, in the ballot box, or on a stage. So we are winning, no matter how it looks. The last one is you gotta be willing to be uncomfortable, get uncomfortable, and make others uncomfortable. So that's the 4 stages, and I'm gonna use the last one for the take action. First and foremost, is you must recognize the existence and the power of black people, period. If we are not centering blackness in reproductive justice, if we're not centering blackness in the end of HIV, if we're not centering blackness, I'm not saying to the exclusion of anybody else, but as a people, I don't care where you go on this planet, any country, wherever their view is darker, wherever the blackness is described as oppression, that's where HIV lives, that's where violence lives, that's where reproductive injustice lives. And so if you don't trust black women, you are already not winning. Trust black women. Follow our lead. When I learned that in Argentina and in Colombia and in Mexico and other places are using the reproductive justice framework to win your wins, but we can't get our own communities to listen to black women and brown women in the U.S. For our wins. You want to know how we lost Roe v. Wade? It's because they didn't listen. Because they didn't listen. Do you know how we got the Hyde Amendment, which restricts using any public funding for abortion in the U.S.? The Hyde Amendment has now not been attached to 2 U.S. annual budgets. Why? Because people use the black women's reproductive justice agenda to fight against it, and we are winning. So that last part is really critical. And if you're in the science, if you're developing programs, if you're creating new organizations, if you're putting some new ideas to work, if you do not know how to use the lived experience of the people you're doing it for and with as your data, the indigenous expertise that comes with that lived experience is so much more powerful than what you find in your lab, or how many people you can count, or how many folks you tested, or how many folks you're yielding. If you're not listening and engaging and incorporating their stories and their solutions, you will never reach the end of whatever that problem might be. And I had a band behind me. She's talking about the religious and I think it's quite important that we hear, we see it, we name it, we call it out, because institutions
traditional exclusion is alive. Now many of us are not starting from the same or on the same level in the line. So if you are an athlete, you'll understand some are way behind, right? Because of the very same institutional exclusion and systematic violence and discrimination. So for me, it starts with awareness. Many women, for instance, in South Africa, marched in 1956 to be recognized just around gender equality. By the way, even when we speak about reproductive justice, we still are going to have to fight patriarchy, misogyny. We still have to be fighting all these sides of crime, right? Then at the same time, you have to fight the colonial laws that are subjecting us and our bodies into another dimension of issues. Then we're fighting inequality, social and economic equality. The fact that I don't have that power, the fact that I don't have that resource, and then I become the subject, as Dázon has said. So there are many struggles that we have to unpack. We need to unpack the legal environment, create a labor space. We need to educate kids. But lastly, to the point around solidarity. And I want to emphasize this point. You know, the first black woman in South Africa to study abroad, you know, this was a woman who stood up for many issues. She was in the faith sector. And I want to say something. This music is just irritating and they can shut out of me, but I want to say about something of what she said. That this work we are doing as activists, as advocates, is not for us. This work is personal, yes, but it's not for us. It's we can take somebody with us, and if we can create the many tables, and if we can create the space, we will be fighting this injustice. And she said it because it's not only about an individual, but it's for you, and you, and you, and I. And until all of us are free, none of us are free.
Thank you, Steve. So we actually do have more time. This discussion is we're supposed to have another half an hour for this discussion. I do want to say that this thing with the stage, it's. I don't mean to throw a wet blanket on this or a downer, but you know, these are really important conversations, and there's something so insane about having to compete with. Anyway, whatever. This is madness, but so it is. Okay, so a few things before we continue and open this up to the group. First, I want to say, as others have, that this space, the Women's Networking Zone, some of you have been. Let me pose this as a question: how many of you have been to